Good evening, everyone. Brave crew to brave the cold, and I think it's a blizzard out there. No, just sprinkles. We don't want that. Now that I'm a pastor, I used to like the snow. I don't anymore. Now I know what my old pastor, Father Healy, had to deal with shoveling and all that. He didn't shovel, but he saw the bills. But anyway, it's wonderful to be here tonight. There's an old dictum that you can't love what you don't know. And so tonight you've all come together to hear about this great teaching of the Church of our Lord, a centuries-long prophecy of the coming of the Messiah. We're not doing it alone, we have help. And tonight I welcome Mr. Cole DeSantis. Now I've known Cole for, 3 years now?
Yeah.
At least 2 years? And I knew him back at my old parish when little old me, assistant pastor, I needed help with the RCIA program. And so Cole helped out, particularly with one of my candidates. He was teaching my candidate more than what I was doing. I couldn't believe it. Great for RCIA. But he has received his bachelor's and master's degree from Providence College, my alma mater, great place. And he's a public speaker, both of theology and a lecturer as well. So he's spoken here, he's speaking at St. Mary's, he's speaking all around. But he's just getting his start as well, or restart, because he had to get the master's degree. So Cole, it's wonderful having you here to speak to us on these topics. Now I'm going to take this prayer from a wonderful book, you might have it, the Magnificat Advent Companion. And so we'll begin. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Most merciful Father, increase our faith, increase our desire to know you, to love you, and to trust you this Advent. Help us to grow in humility and confidence in your love. We wish to amaze you with our faith, with the knowledge that we obtain. We ask that through these presentations, this time to learn about you in the faith, particularly through the prophecies of Isaiah, we may come to a deeper knowledge and love of you and rejoice on Christmas morning. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. There are extra copies of these if you didn't get a chance to get one on the back table there. I swear I don't get a kickback. I should. I know. All right, Cole. Great. Good.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out. As Father Bale said, my name is Cole DeSantis. I got both my bachelor's and master's degree in theology from Providence College. And one thing you need to know about me is theology is something that I just live and breathe, And when I was a little kid, I came from a family that was both very devout, but they also valued education a lot. And they taught me the faith at a relatively early age. But I remember, and I guess this is universal among children, I always used to ask questions. Where is that in the Bible? What do we mean when we pray that? Yada, yada, yada. Just asking more questions they probably want to hear. And a lot of people in my family are, highly educated, but very few of them actually have a direct degree in theology. So it quickly got to the point to where, I was asking questions that were probably more advanced than I knew, but they never put a damper on me asking questions. And then when I was in high school, they, one thing, I actually went to Bishop Hendricken, and the first thing they did, freshman year, is they gave us a Bible. And they taught us, like freshman, sophomore year, they taught us Old Testament and New Testament scripture. And that's what really got me comfortable with the scriptures itself. And I remember coming home every weekday, and at the end of the day, and I would just dump all this stuff that I learned onto whoever was giving me a ride that day. And eventually, I don't know if this was out of desperation to get me to be quiet or what, but they were like, you know what, you should get a degree in theology. College application is coming soon, so you should think about doing that. And the rest is, you could say, history. Now, the thing is, right now, Christmas is upon us. So actually today was the first Sunday of Advent. And the thing is, now is when people really start to hustle. Now people are rushing and they're getting gifts and they're preparing meals and, they're preparing for the family that's coming from our state. It's just 8 million things are happening all at once. And in a sense, it's easy to get sucked into that. Between the heartwarming music and the movies that are kind of like funny, but in a corny sort of way, and then, just the family events and the big meals, and it's easy to get wrapped up in that and to just end with that. And when you ask a lot of people, why do we celebrate Christmas? A lot of them tend to say more general humanistic sort of answers. So it's about family, it's about giving, it's about this, that, and the other thing. And all those are true, but those are really secondary reasons for the holiday. A lot of people, at least most people in this audience, know that Christmas is a religious holiday. It's of Christian origins. But a lot of people will say things like, oh, well, it's about Jesus. It's about commemorating his birth. And again, that's true. But a lot of people don't actually think about how much profundity is just in that one statement. Christmas is about the birth of Jesus. Now, on the other hand, you see a lot of people who are, somewhat puritanical. They have a little bit of this attitude of, if you give gifts on Christmas or watch Christmas movies, that's a sign that you're materialistic and you don't get the spirit of the holiday. Well, historically speaking, going back to the earliest days of Christianity, there have been, celebrations, and sometimes even big celebrations surrounding Christmas. So that's not a bad thing. But the thing is, you have to realize that the purpose of these celebrations is to give expression to a sense of joy. And what is the cause of our joy? So the joy that is often associated with the Christmas season is actually of a very deep, profound spiritual nature. It's not like any joy that we get from anything else. And the thing is, the incarnation, which is the act of God becoming man in the person of Jesus, along with his death and resurrection, is what lies at the core of our salvation. There is no good greater than that of God. And because of what Jesus did in becoming human and dying on the cross, we get to enter into a relationship with God of a level that would not be possible, or really a relationship at any level wouldn't be possible, if it wasn't for what God accomplished through Jesus. And so I'd like to look at just a few relatively brief quotes that summarize this. So, how many people here have been to the Christmas, the midnight mass on Christmas? So quite a few of you have. So there's actually a prayer that's said on that particular mass, and it's the Christmas proclamation. And it ends with the prayer, quote, "Jesus Christ, eternal God and Son of the eternal Father, desiring to consecrate the world by his most loving presence, was conceived of the Holy Spirit, and when 9 months passed since his conception, was born of the Virgin Mary and became man," unquote. Now, y'all know the preface prayer, so the ones that begin with, "The Lord be with you, and with your spirit lift up your hearts." There's a few different preface prayers for the Feast of Christmas. And for the second preface associated with Christmas, it says, quote, "Though invisible in his own divine nature, Christ appears visibly in ours, so that, raising up in himself all that was cast down, he might restore unity to all creation and call all of creation back to his heavenly kingdom," unquote. So think about how profound that is. Humanity, corrupted by sin, but we are made holy. We are consecrated to God because God became one of us. St. Augustine, in one of his Christmas sermons, said, quote, "Wake up, O man, it was for you that God was made man." And then he goes, so, "Wake up, O man, it was for you that God was made man. For you, I say, God was made man. Eternal death would have awaited you, had he not been born in time. Never would you have been freed from your sinful flesh, had he not taken to himself the likeness of sinful flesh. Everlasting would be your misery, had he not performed this act of mercy. You would not have come to life again, had he not come to die your death. You would have been broken down, had he not come to help you. You would have perished, had he not come." So there's this contrast between the greatness of what God does in Christ and the lowliness of the human condition. And because of what Jesus did in the incarnation, the human race becomes united to God. And we are elevated spiritually and morally. Actually, this is actually a topic I hope to examine in my next lecture at this time next week. So it'll be another reason to show up to the entire lecture series. But the important thing here is that when you look at all the themes that I just presented right now, there's so much that could be said about it. And the Bible itself says a lot about it. And so today we are going to focus on a specific biblical text. The book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14. Now all of you probably know this verse. This is one of those biblical verses where if I just say Isaiah 7:14, some of you may not necessarily know what the words or what the actual content of the verse is, but a lot of you have probably heard of it, even if you haven't heard of it. So, does anyone want to take a guess as to what? What? That's actually close. I believe that's also in Isaiah. But actually, let's make reference to a famous Christmas song. It's of the more religious-themed Christmas songs. This is the most popular. O come, Emmanuel. So that song is actually based on this verse. And so the verse in question is, quote, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall name him Emmanuel," unquote. So that's the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14. That's the verse we're going to be meditating upon tonight. Now there's a lot in that verse. So just based on the surface, how it relates to us as Catholics and as Christians may not necessarily be obvious. And if you do know the meaning of this verse, there's so many levels of meaning, it's just your heads are probably spinning. So we have to sort of step back and remember the number one most important rule of biblical theology. Context is everything. So let's look a little bit at the prophet Isaiah himself. So the prophet Isaiah lived around the 8th century BC. Actually, it's interesting because based on the book of the prophet Isaiah itself, there are some verses that give us a few short biographical notes about him. And so there's actually one verse, Isaiah chapter 8, verses 3 through 4, that seems to imply that Isaiah had a wife, who was also a prophet, and had at least one child. Now, a lot of people, when they think about prophets, they think of them as like lone wolf kind of figures, some mystic sitting in a cave who has a mystical experience in which he hears the voice of God, and then he goes out in public and he tells everyone what he heard. And there were some prophets who were like that. But Isaiah himself is a little bit different. And in fact, in the Old Testament, it wasn't uncommon for prophets to actually have disciples. People who would, record their prophecies, who would sort of look at, what's the deeper message of what this guy's saying, and would keep alive this person's teachings. So this was actually the case, not with all, but certainly with a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament. And that was definitely the case with Isaiah himself. Now, interestingly, based on the fact that Isaiah spent a lot of his time in and near Jerusalem, a lot of biblical scholars believe that Isaiah was originally from Jerusalem. And since he delivers a lot of his prophecies to the king of Israel, a lot of people believe that he was a politically well-connected individual as well. Now, the book of the prophet Isaiah itself, as a text, actually has kind of a complicated history. There are slight nuances in the writing style at some parts. So a lot of biblical scholars divided the book of the prophet Isaiah into three main parts. The first part, which is called First Isaiah, which is the first 39 chapters, is actually believed to have been written by the prophet Isaiah himself or by one of his direct followers, and was actually dates back to the 8th century itself. But then you have what's called Second Isaiah, which is chapters 40 through 55, which it's believed not to have actually have been written by Isaiah, but is believed by some biblical scholars to have been written about 2 centuries later, in the 6th century BC, by a prophet who was a disciple of Isaiah. And then you have chapters 56 through 66, which is the last 10 chapters, called Third Isaiah, which was actually written in the 5th century BC, so about a century later, again, not by the prophet Isaiah himself, but by another one of his disciples. So that's a little bit of the history of Isaiah himself and the sort of history of the text. But now we have to step back a little bit. So now that we know a little bit about Isaiah, we have to know what was he actually responding to when he penned those verses. And so now in order to understand that, we kind of have to look at the history of ancient Israel. So to make it extraordinarily brief, if you were to go back to the very beginning of the Bible, so the book of Genesis, based on what it says about the people of Israel in the book of Genesis, they started off as a kind of a small series, a group of distantly related nomadic tribes that lived in the Levant, which that part of the Middle East, right where Syria and Israel are. Think about everything north of Egypt and like south of Turkey, so that general area. And eventually there was a series of really bad famines that just devastated large chunks of the Middle East. And because Egypt wasn't hit as hard, a lot of different tribes from throughout the Middle East began to settle in Egypt, one of them being the ancient Israelites, the Jews. And what happened was the Israelites, when they were in Egypt, began to populate and grow at such a rapid rate that the Egyptians became afraid that this was undermining their political power. Like these foreign people are coming into our country and are populating at an extremely large rate. So what the Egyptians did was they forced the Israelites into slavery. But eventually, after roughly 400 years of slavery in Egypt, many of the Israelites left Egypt and returned to their homeland. That's basically what's described in the book of Exodus, as well as in some of the books that follow that. And through a mix of military conquest and intermarriage, the Israelites eventually became the dominant group in the Holy Land. Just a little bit more history, when the Israelites first settled in the Holy Land, there were 12, now don't forget, there were 12 tribes that constituted the people of Israel. And what they did was they divided the land up into 12 sections. Each one was governed by its own set of leaders. So it's kind of like what you see in the United States today, not quite the same, but think about something like that. Each tribe had its own territory, and the leaders of that territory, they were the ones who made most of the decisions on a day-to-day level. But then, for issues that affected the people of Israel as a whole, you would see representatives of each of the tribes. They would all come together and make decisions that affected the people as a whole. Those were known as the judges. Eventually, in the late 11th century, so this is about 1,000 years before Jesus, the people of Israel eventually said they wanted a king. And the first king of Israel was King Sommer, who was actually a very prominent military leader. His successor was King David. And if anyone here who knows the story of David, this is where things start to get kind of weird, because David wasn't actually Saul's son. David was some random guy who was actually just a peasant. He lived in like the rural back areas of Israel and worked as a shepherd. He had no political experience, no military experience, no diplomatic experience, but God gave a prophecy to the prophet Samuel and said, I want him to be my next king. So what happened was David became an apprentice of Saul, and then when he was anointed king, God also made a promise to David that not only would David be king, but all of his descendants would be king, basically for as long as Israel existed. So, and then David's son was King Solomon. Now, when everyone talks about the kings of ancient Israel, they always talk about, Saul, David, Solomon. But why? This is also where things get a little bit messy. This is where we're going to learn. The Middle East hasn't really changed much since biblical times, because after 3 kings, those are the only 3 kings that ruled over a united kingdom in Israel. Basically what happened was King Solomon started a bunch of large infrastructure projects. And how he did that was, how he funded these projects was through raising taxes. So what eventually happened was, people didn't like that. So when Solomon died, his son, a guy by the name of Rehoboam, came to power. Rehoboam happened to be the wrong guy at the wrong time, because during his reign, one of Solomon's political advisors, now there's going to be a test later, so try to remember the difference. One of his advisors was a guy named Jeroboam. So Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam was the king. Jeroboam was one of his political advisors. And Jeroboam started a rebellion against the king, and during this rebellion, 10 out of the 12 tribes broke away and formed their own kingdom. Now, just as a side note, both of these kingdoms claimed to be the actual successors of the kingdom of Israel as it existed under the first 3 kings, Saul, David, Solomon. So they both call themselves Israel. To avoid confusion, a lot of biblical scholars will just call it the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, since the 10 tribes in the north lived in the northern half, and the 2 tribes that remained loyal lived in the south. So, now the thing is, sometimes the Bible refers to the northern kingdom as the kingdom of Ephraim, since that was the largest of the 10 tribes that lived there. And the southern kingdom is sometimes called the kingdom of Judah, since that was the largest tribe that lived in the southern half. So that's a little bit of the context. But that's still a few hundred years before Isaiah. So what was the specific thing that Isaiah was responding to? Well, let's skip ahead to the 8th century. You saw the Assyrians. Now, anyone who studied ancient history probably knows a little bit about the Assyrians. They were actually an empire based in what is now Iraq. And at the time of Isaiah, they were growing rapidly. They were taking over large parts of the Middle East. And so everyone was making decisions about, how are we going to respond? What are we going to do? So what happened was, the kingdom of Judah, they knew that they were too weak to actually put up a fight from a military perspective. So they just became a vassal state. Basically what that means is, part of our tax dollars will go towards the Assyrians. We'll sort of give lip service to the Assyrian king, and in return they'll just sort of leave us alone and won't really attack us. But then, the northern kingdom, Ephraim, they formed an alliance with the kingdom of Aram, which is in what is now Syria. And Aram and Ephraim, these 2 kingdoms, they thought, if we work together, we'll be able to fight against the Assyrians. But they're like, hey, it'll work better if we get more people involved. So what they did was they started putting pressure on Judah to get involved in the alliance. But what happened was, Judah, they knew better. They knew it's going to be very difficult to fight against the Assyrians, so we don't want anything to do with this. So Judah found itself in another political situation, because on top of having to deal with the Assyrians, their neighbors to the north were putting pressure on them. Basically, if you don't become our ally, we're going to attack you. We're basically going to treat you as if you were an enemy and just invade you. So there was all these different political things going on. And so now that you know the historical context, let's get into the text itself. So in order to understand Isaiah 7:14, you kind of have to situate it within the context of its proper themes. And the main themes connected with Isaiah 7:14 are articulated a few verses earlier. So let's look at Isaiah 7:4-5. So Isaiah 7:4-5 says, quote, so this is a message that God is giving to Isaiah to then give to King Ahaz, who was the king of Judah. And it says, quote, say to him, take care that you remain calm and do not fear. Do not let your courage fail between these two stumps of smoldering brands, the blazing anger of Rezin and the Arameans and the son of Remaliah, because Aram and Ephraim with the son of Remaliah has planned evil against you, unquote. So then let's look at Isaiah 7:7-9, where it says, quote, thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, it shall not be. The head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah, unquote. So there's actually a lot of meanings in these verses. The first has to do with basically divine providence. So divine providence is the notion that God has a larger plan. Everything that happens in accordance with God's plan. Now when evil happens, God doesn't directly cause evil, or else he wouldn't be perfectly good and therefore wouldn't be God. But evil happens because God permits it. That is, he doesn't stop it. And it only happens to the extent that God permits it. So if God doesn't permit an evil to happen, it won't happen. And if it does happen, it will never happen more than the amount that God permits it to happen. So if God doesn't allow Ephraim and Samaria to attack Judah, then the attack is not going to be successful. But there's also another theme. And the other theme has to do with the concept of covenant. Now, the concept of covenants, that's a big part of the theology of the Old Testament. And so, does anyone here know what a covenant is? So, some of you are shaking your head. So, a covenant, as you know, is basically a never-ending relationship. It's a permanent relationship between two individuals or groups. That's to say, it's a relationship that can never be broken, or that can only be broken under the most severe of circumstances. And the reason for this is because a covenant is rooted in certain responsibilities that each side has to the other side. And because of that, a covenant can never be broken. And the radical claim of the Old Testament is that God formed a covenant with the people of Israel. So the covenant with Israel goes back to Abraham. If you go back to the book of Genesis, it says that all of the people of Israel were the descendants of the prophet Abraham. And Abraham formed a covenant with God, or God rather initiated it. God formed a covenant with Abraham in which he said that if you place your trust in me and obey me, I will protect and bless you, and I will protect and bless all of your descendants. And this covenant was passed on from Abraham to all of Abraham's descendants. And basically, the parameters of the covenant were, if you, the people of Israel, obey my commands and only worship me, the one true God, I will bless you, and I will protect you, and you will prosper. That's why the Old Testament is predicated on the view, whenever anything good happens, that was a sign of God's blessing. Whenever anything bad happens, that was a punishment for the people of Israel for having violated or deviated from the covenant. So basically, let's go back to these two verses here. Note how it says, the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you understand the concept of covenant, that part will make perfect sense. Because the capital city was seen as and by extension the king, was seen as the embodiment of everything a nation was and everything a nation stood for. When you go to the kingdom of Aram, well, the kingdom of Aram was a pagan nation. You see, the kingdom of Israel and Judah, who was their legitimate successor, they were the only country born out of a covenant with God. But Aram they came into existence through the normal human means. They founded out of a covenant. And when you look at the kingdom of Ephraim, they were once a part of the people of Israel, but they broke away. They sort of betrayed the covenant. So when you look at Aram, the head of the kingdom of Aram was a king named Rezin. And the head of the kingdom of Ephraim was King Pekah, who was sometimes called the son of Amalia. So basically, what God is saying through the prophet Isaiah is that these people don't get their authority from God. Whereas when you go to Jerusalem, the king of Judah, as a descendant of King David, gets his authority from God. So the ultimate authority for Israel is God, and whoever God chose to be their leader. So ultimately what you see with the Arameans and the Ephraimites, as well as with the Assyrians, is people who are not a part of the people of God, trying to attack the people of God. And God is basically saying that you have my perpetual promise of protection, that whatever happens, the foils, the plans of your enemies are not going to be successful. So, there were three main, well, in some sense there's four when you look at it from a more thematic perspective. But from an historical perspective, there were three main issues. There was a divided kingdom, the threat of Assyrian invasion, and the threat of invasion from Judah's neighbors to the north. And within that context, basically the verses immediately leading up to it talk about the covenant promises. God is going to remain loyal to his covenant promises. Things seemed crazy at that time, but that's not a sign that God isn't present. God is present even in the midst of all the stuff going on at that time, and God is going to be there for his people, protecting his people. Now that we understand the historical context, let's get directly to the verse itself. So Isaiah 7, verses 10 through 13, God basically tells Isaiah to go up to King Ahaz and tell Ahaz to ask God for a sign. Basically, God was like, if you want to know that I'm legitimate in my promises, ask for a sign, and I will give you a sign. And that sign will be a symbolic representation of my continued presence among you. So Isaiah goes up to King Ahaz and says, ask God for a sign. But then King Ahaz says, no, I don't want to put God to the test. He misinterpreted what Isaiah said as him putting God to the test. He didn't want to anger God. Now this actually made the situation worse, because Isaiah he got angry at that statement. Because the text presents Ahaz's statement as itself being born out of a lack of trust in God. If he truly trusted God, he would do whatever God said. And in this case, he would ask God for a sign, and whatever sign God provided, he would trust in that. So, in fact, Isaiah in chapter 7, verse 13, he says, quote, "Listen, O house of David, is it not enough that you weary human beings? Must you also weary my God?" Unquote. So Isaiah wasn't taking this well. So then, in the first half of Isaiah 14, Isaiah says, quote, "Therefore the Lord himself will provide a sign," unquote. Basically, because Ahaz lacked the courage to ask God for a sign, Isaiah basically says that God himself will directly provide a sign. And what is the sign? Well, that's where Isaiah 7:14 comes in. So Isaiah 7:14, as I said before, quote, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall name him Emmanuel," unquote. Now, a few sort of side notes. The term used here for virgin is actually the Hebrew term halma. Now, a literal translation of that is young woman or unmarried woman. That's not the same as the Hebrew term for virgin. The Hebrew term for virgin was betula. Now, the thing is, a lot of biblical scholars have noted that the terms betula and halma had different emphasis. One was on the virginity element, the other was just on the more youth element. But the thing is, because these terms are very similar, they were very often used interchangeably. So now in the Greek translation, they translated it as virgin. Again, partly because these two terms were extremely similar, and in the Hebrew could be used interchangeably. So what was the sign? The sign was that there would be a young woman. But who was the young woman who would give birth? A lot of biblical scholars, and this is clear based on the immediate historical context, that was King Ahaz's wife. Now the thing is, who is Emmanuel? Because we know that Emmanuel was not the name of Ahaz's son. Ahaz's son was named Hezekiah. So what's up with the name Emmanuel? So the thing you got to remember is that Emmanuel was not meant to be the actual literal name of the child. The child's name was whatever the parents wanted it to be. But Emmanuel was a symbolic title. It was basically not meant to identify the actual name, but rather a quality. So the thing is, the term Emmanuel in Hebrew means God with us, or God is with us. Basically, think about it this way. You're being invaded from all sides. Your kingdom is divided. But then God tells you that in the future, your king will give birth to a son. What that means is that the Davidic line, which God promised would last forever, is going to continue for another generation. So think about what that means. The king is going to have a son, and he's probably going to end up having a son. So for the next generation, the Davidic line is going to survive, which means whatever happens with all this political craziness, it's not going to be the end of Israel. So Israel is going to survive through all of this. So thus, the continuation of the kingly line, that was the sign of God's continuing presence among and his protection of the people of Israel. Now, a lot of you may be saying, well, that's all fine and good. But what does the events connected with an ancient civilization from over 2,000 years ago, what does that have to do with us as Catholics and as Christians today? You know, especially when we're talking about Christmas. So it's like, how does any of this have to do with anything we're doing in Mass? And a lot of you may say, oh, well, Israel exists today, but it's not a kingdom. The political authorities in Israel are not directly connected to the kingdom of Israel as it existed in ancient times. That completely collapsed a few decades after the time of Jesus. So you might be saying, how is this prophecy fulfilled? Or maybe it was just for that time. But again, why would anyone care after the collapse of the Jewish kingdom? Because of the First Jewish-Roman War. Well, this is where we get into the next major principle of biblical interpretation. The first is that context is everything. The second is that Jesus is the center of God's plan of salvation. So everything in the Old Testament and everything in the New Testament, it all revolves around Jesus. So it's either a preparation for or a response to what Jesus did. So everything in the Old Testament has two levels of meaning. The first level of meaning is what that text would have meant for its immediate audience. So Isaiah 7:14, how would an Israelite living 2,700 years ago, what would they have heard? What would they have understood when they read that verse? But then the deeper message is, how does that point towards Christ? Because divine revelation technically didn't end until the death of the last apostle. So everything before Christ is pointing ahead. It's pointing to the future, towards Jesus. So, and that's why you can't understand the New Testament unless you first understand the Old Testament. Because the New Testament presupposes a lot of theological concepts borrowed from the Old Testament. And it references the Old Testament a lot. So, in order to properly appreciate this verse, you have to look at how it parallels certain things in the New Testament. Now, thankfully, finding out how Isaiah 7:14 parallels the New Testament is actually really easy, because it's directly quoted in the New Testament. So, the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 2, verses 22 to 23. After describing the birth of Jesus, it says, quote, "All of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet Isaiah. Behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us, unquote. So, how does any of this connect to Jesus? Well, remember rule number 1 of Catholic biblical interpretation. Context is everything. So now let's look a little bit at the Gospel of Matthew itself. So the Gospel of Matthew was written by the Apostle Matthew or by someone who was an immediate follower of Matthew. A lot of biblical scholars date it back to between the years 85 and 90 AD, and it was most likely written to a community of Jewish converts to Christianity, mostly living in the Levant, and even then, most likely living somewhere in or near Syria. Now, the thing was, anyone who knows the early history of Christianity knows the story. Basically, the Old Testament, it talks about this figure called the Messiah. The Jews believe in the Messiah. Christians started off as a movement within Judaism that basically claimed that Jesus, this man named Jesus of Nazareth, was the Messiah. But this caused a lot of tension because not all Jews believed Jesus was the Messiah. Now, the last thing that Jesus said before he ascended into heaven was go forth and preach the gospel to all people. That's a concept that actually we're going to talk about a little bit later. But the apostles believed they had a duty to preach the gospel to all people, both Jews and non-Jews. But some early Christians, and including the Apostle Matthew, preached a lot to their fellow Jews. So whenever you saw a Jewish community that had a lot of Christians, tension inevitably followed. There was a lot of debate between, this was talking about between neighbors, between relatives, between friends, about whether or not Jesus was actually the Messiah. It's like the debates between Catholics and Protestants today. Think about the level of tension that it used to exist there, and it was the same thing among a lot of Jewish communities at the time of Matthew. And so Matthew's number one priority was to try to showcase that there was this fundamental continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament, to sort of prove that Jesus met all of the Old Testament standards of the Messiah. Now, it's for this reason that actually Matthew quotes from the Old Testament more than any other gospel. I've tried to look up a few different estimates, and one estimate says that Matthew's gospel quotes from the Old Testament 96 times. Compare that to Luke's gospel at only 58 times. And look at John at 40 times, and Mark at only 34 times. So Matthew had a specific set of issues that he was dealing with. He was writing to a community of Jewish Christians, so he was writing to a community that was deeply divided. So as a result, when you look at direct quotes of the Old Testament found in the New Testament, a lot of them are in Matthew. Because Matthew was trying to show, you see all these things in the Old Testament? They have their parallel in Jesus, because they were fulfilled in Jesus. Now, a prime example of this is how Matthew quotes on the book of the prophet Isaiah. So the context is in Matthew chapter 1. Matthew talks about the genealogy of Jesus. He then proceeds to talk about the story of Jesus' birth. Basically, y'all know the story. Mary becomes betrothed to St. Joseph, but then she becomes pregnant. Now, she became pregnant by the power of the Holy Spirit. But she became pregnant before their marriage. And St. Joseph didn't know the cause. So, being a righteous man, he sought to basically divorce the Virgin Mary, but he was going to do it secretly because he was also a kind man and didn't want to put her to shame. But one day, when he was sleeping, he had a dream in which an angel appeared to him and told him that Mary was going to be the mother of the Messiah, and that he had a duty to serve as the protector of Mary and of Jesus. And that's what he did. He basically served as Mary and Jesus' protector, and basically went through with the marriage. And it was at the end of describing that Matthew quotes from Isaiah 7:14. So, what is the purpose of that? What's Matthew trying to say? Well, Matthew is trying to say that Jesus is Emmanuel. What does that mean? Well, Jesus himself is the definitive sign of God's continuing presence among the people of Israel. You see, Jesus, don't forget what I said before, everything in the Old Testament was meant to be a preparation of something in the New Testament. So everything that God revealed within the covenant with Israel pointed towards Jesus. And so when Jesus became man, when he preached, when he performed miracles, when he died, when he rose from the dead, he fulfilled the covenant between God and Israel. But he didn't do away with the covenant. What he did in fulfilling it was he elevated it. He brought it to a deeper level of spiritual meaning. And so the covenant still stands. But after the time of Jesus, you become a member of the covenant through faith in Jesus and through baptism. So all of you here are members of the covenant. Anyone here who's a practicing faithful Catholic, which I suppose most of you are, all of you are, you are the people of God. You are the chosen people. You are the members of the covenant. But the thing is, the covenant was opened up to you because of Jesus. Because, you see, God chose to reveal what he did before Jesus. So all the stuff in the Old Testament, he decided to reveal to the Jews. He entrusted it to the Jews. But it had implications for all of mankind. We are all sinners. We're all in need of redemption. And so as a result, when Jesus died on the cross, when he became man, when he rose from the dead, he opened up the covenant to all of humanity. And that's why Jesus said what he said as the last thing he said before he ascended into heaven. Go forth and preach the gospel to all people, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. He said to all people. And so now all of us are being brought into the covenant. But note how in Isaiah 7:14, God says he will remain true to the covenant. He will ensure that nothing, not Ephraim, not Aram, not Assyria, no one will destroy or undermine the covenant. And he fulfills that in Jesus. Jesus brought the covenant to what it is today. That's why in Matthew 16, Jesus says, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. He's continuing what you saw in the Old Testament. But this leads to an even more radical claim. Among a lot of Jews, especially at the time of Jesus and shortly thereafter, there was a lot of debate about how are we to conceptualize the notion of divine providence. And we're going to talk a little bit about this next week, but there was a big debate because the Jews believe God isn't a created thing. God, like you can't say the king is God. I can't create an idol and say that that's God. The forces of nature are not God. God is outside of creation. Now we all take that for granted today, but if you go back to the time of ancient Israel, they were the first people to propose that. The Bible was the first text to say that there's a distinction between God and creation. So, you have this notion of God's transcendence, but then you have the notion that God is also present to his people. He's intimately involved in the affairs of history. And so how do you conceptualize divine immanence, divine closeness, within the context of also affirming divine transcendence? And so there's a lot of debates about that. But the radical claim of the Apostle Matthew is that he affiliates the presence of God with a human, with a person. So while still admitting that God is transcendent, he says that God is present in a man, that there's a human within whom the fullness of the divine dwells. Now, as church teaching developed, there began to be more clarity added to these biblical statements. So think about, the church's current belief that Jesus is one person with two natures, eternally begotten of the Father. He assumed flesh without ceasing to be God. But all of this was an attempt to clarify what was said in the Bible. And Matthew takes this paradox and makes it explicit. He associates the divine presence with the human, with the man, even with a child, because he quotes Isaiah 7:14 within the infancy narrative. So think about the radicalness of this. And it is this which we are celebrating in Christmas. We are celebrating the fact that Jesus is Emmanuel. Jesus is God with us. He is God among us. So when you look at the Bible in light of that, you begin to see a deeper symbolic meaning. So Assyria and the Syro-Ephraimite alliance, that was a symbol for sin and for the devil. But the concept of Emmanuel pointed towards Jesus. By becoming human, by dwelling literally among us, God among us in the flesh, he counteracts sin. That's the way God chose to fight against the snares of the devil. That's the way in which he chose to redeem us from our sin. And that is the point of Christmas. That humanity through sin rebelled against God. But God never abandons us. God will never abandon us. He continues to be present to his creation, guiding them towards salvation. And by becoming present to his creation in the person of Jesus, he elevates us. Now, in the Byzantine tradition, which is basically the liturgical tradition that developed in places like Greece and Turkey and Eastern Europe, so I'm sure Father Bale could tell you more about this, but this church and most Catholic churches are what's called the Latin tradition. In the Byzantine tradition, which is out in one of the Eastern churches, they actually have a chant that's sung on Christmas. And the words go, "Today is born of a virgin he who holds the whole of creation in his hand. He whose essence none can touch is bound in swaddling clothes as a child. He who established the heavens in the beginning lives in a manger." Now think about that. Let that sink in for a moment. The one whom no one can see dwelt among us in our presence as one of us. And because of this, we as Christians, we can cry out with all boldness, with all confidence to our Heavenly Father, saying, O come, Emmanuel. Save your captive people who are dwelling in lonely exile here upon the earth. Shine thine light upon us, calling us to yourself, driving away the gloominess of the spiritual darkness of sin, giving us the true spiritual joy that comes only through you. Save us from the depths of hell and from the tyranny of evil through your liberative power. And in response of that, we can turn to the people of God. We can turn to our fellow Christians. And we can even think to ourselves, rejoice, rejoice, for Emmanuel has come to thee. And with that in mind, I'd like to complete my sermon for today. And just basically thank you all for coming out. So I know that was a lot for a 1 hour lecture, but I'd like to open up the floor for questions and answers. And if anyone here has any questions, feel free to ask. Yes?
It seemed to me that Matthew was quite elderly when he wrote his gospel. Is that true? I never had thought that people even lived that long.
Well, that's actually a very good question. So basically, her question was, Matthew seems to have been quite elderly when he wrote his gospel. So Now, it's interesting though, because and now this gets into a lot of different things. We know that over the course of human history, over the course of human evolution, human genetics have changed. So all the human remains prove that the average lifespan was less than 30. Once modern humans emerged, we had the physical capacity to live as long as we're living now. The thing is, modern medicine didn't exist. So basically, if you got a disease or a really bad illness, you were basically out of luck. But it wasn't uncommon for people to live old ages, even back in the day. So St. Augustine, for example, he actually lived to be the age of 80. So he was born in the 350s AD. He died in the, actually no, he was born a little bit later. So he died in the 320s, So he actually lived to be close to 20, he died in the actually I'm starting to forget the date. Come on. No. I'm sorry.
None of us would know if you're wrong. So
yeah. So I'll be honest, I haven't been getting good sleep lately, but you know what? I'll be honest, that doesn't stop me from being completely on point today. But so as long as St. Augustine lived to be 80. So, but he was living in the late 4th and early 5th century. So another example, now this is more recent, but this is still like a century ago. They didn't have a lot of the technology out today. Think about Pope Leo XIII or Pope Pius IX. Both of those guys lived to be like well into like their 70s, 80s kind of thing. Actually, I think Leo XIII may have lived to be close to 90. So that wasn't unheard of back before our time. Now, concerning Matthew's gospel, or concerning the writing of the gospels in general, there are no strict, hard and fast dates. Like, the thing is, unfortunately, the original text written by Matthew, hasn't actually been found. It's unfortunately probably been lost to time. So it's not like we can do carbon datings based on the original. So a lot of how we date biblical texts is by looking at the text itself. So basically going, okay, so what does the text tell us about the state of Christianity at that time? So what that means is the church, it grows and it evolves. So what does that text say? Like based on how a text was written, what phase was Christianity at in its history at that time? And so based on that, we then come up with rough estimates. So if we look at like Mark's gospel is very simplistic in its style. So that implies that it was probably written first, at a stage in church history when church teaching was much more simple. Also, Mark's gospel puts a lot of emphasis on eschatology, so a lot of this end time stuff, which implies that it was probably written around the time of the First Jewish-Roman War, which ended with the destruction of Jerusalem. And a lot of Jesus' prophecies about the end times talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. So a lot of people say, okay, Mark's gospel was probably written around like the 60s or 70s AD. But then Matthew's gospel actually borrows a lot from Mark's gospel. So does Luke. So a lot of people say, well, Mark and Luke, or Matthew and Luke, had to have been written after Mark. So this is this whole elaborate thing about biblical history. But based on what we know about the text, and based on what we know about the relationship between one text and another, we kind of come up with rough estimates as to when the text would have been written. But that's actually a really good question. Was Matthew still alive? Maybe. It depends on how old he was when he started following Jesus. If he wasn't alive, then there's also a chance that it was not written by him, but was written by someone from one of the communities associated with him. And so they would have known his particular emphasis in writing the story of Jesus. And so, again, if it wasn't written by Matthew, it was probably written by someone who knew Matthew. So that's actually a good question. Are there any other questions? Yes, what's your question?
Is the book of Isaiah in the Jewish sacred scriptures? And if it is, how do Jewish people explain who Jesus is?
So that's actually a really good question. Isaiah is actually in the Jewish scriptures. So as an interesting side note, not everything in our Old Testament is actually in the Jewish scriptures. There are some texts that were written relatively late, and there was a lot of debate among Jews as to whether or not they should be in the Bible. They ultimately made it into the Christian version, but not the Jewish version, like 1 and 2 Maccabees, for example, or the Book of Wisdom. But Isaiah is actually one of those texts that's included in the Jewish scriptures. And interestingly, it is probably one of the most popular religious texts among the Jews. I mean, it's in the Jewish liturgy, it's quoted like an extremely large amount of times. How Jews would explain this prophecy? Well, they would basically say that we as Christians are reading into the book of the prophet Isaiah something that isn't there. They would basically say, well, you're really like, but you're adding something to the context, because it was just about the continuation of the Davidic line at the time of Isaiah. It had nothing to do with Jesus. And most people who do see deeper messianic meanings in it, they would say something like, well, you still have to prove that Jesus fulfilled the messianic, basically prophecies and standards, which they don't believe he did, and thus the schism between Judaism and Christianity. As a Catholic and as a Christian, I would respond, you have to go back to the historical facts. So to counteract that claim, you can't really debate Isaiah 7:14 with a Jewish person because they don't share the same set of presuppositions as we do. So you would have to go and look at Jesus, and you would have to look at the New Testament and say, okay, how much does the historical evidence support the New Testament? How much does can you build a good historical case for the notion that Jesus existed? That the people who wrote the New Testament, that they weren't lying, that they weren't all hallucinating, or they weren't being purely symbolic. And then from there, as we begin to build a case for the historical accuracy of the New Testament, then at that point, it becomes easier to demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah. And once you've accepted the premise that Jesus is the Messiah, then everything in the Old Testament you begin to see this deeper meaning to it. That's why, like in the Church Fathers, they would see symbolic, Christ-centered meanings in some of the most random Old Testament passages. Like, take the most obscure Jewish religious law, and chances are some church father wrote on it and tried to connect it with Christ. Even St. Paul does that at times. But you can't get to that point unless you've accepted the premise that Jesus is the Messiah. And I think the easiest way to do that is from a more historical perspective, and I think here the theology follows from that. So that's actually a really good question. So thank you. So does anyone else have any questions? So if you really want to have a good time, then let's have Father ask you some questions and see how well I am under fire.
No. This is wonderful, Cole. This brought me right back to seminary, graduate seminary.
Yeah, and again, this is really important stuff because a lot of this is basics, but it's stuff that we need to know. And it's like, when they say 'tis the reason for the season, what does that mean? And when you really begin to think about the notion of what it means to say God became man, it's like, that should be mind-blowing. Exactly. And in next week's lecture, we're going to kind of talk about the same thing, but from another perspective. So in the next lecture, we're going to not so much talk about the incarnation in of itself, but more about the effects of the incarnation. So again, I'd like to thank you all for showing up today, and you've been a wonderful audience with some wonderful questions. So again, thank you very much, and have a great night, and God bless.
Thank you.
No the